Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge. This video is going to be a walkthrough for a new piece of software that I've written. It's a software MIDI controller. I've written it specifically for this wonderful little synthesizer you can see down here. It's the NymphCC by Dreadbox. Actually, you can see two of them down here. We'll get onto that a little bit later on. Now, this software is basically designed to allow you to control all of the parameters that you can get at on the front panel of a NymphCC, but also some parameters that you can't get at through the front panel. Right, let's have a go at running this MIDI controller, see what it does. Now, I've designed this MIDI controller, this piece of software, not to be a completely standalone product, but actually to run inside a virtual synthesizer environment, a virtual Eurorack environment, and that environment is called Voltage Modular, and it's by a company called Cherry Audio. Now, Voltage Modular is a fantastic product. It is a virtual Eurorack environment. You can put all sorts of modules together with virtual cables and create amazing patches and fantastic sounds. It is amazing, but you don't need to get into all of that stuff in order to use my MIDI controller. However, you do need to have Voltage Modular installed on your computer to start with. So I'm not going to go into the steps you need to do in order to do that. Cherry Audio's website is brilliant. It's very, very clear and simple as to the instructions on how to do it all. You can download Voltage Modular and install it completely free. And once you do so, you're going to need to register with them so that you have an account with them, because at the end of the day, you're going to need to be able to purchase the modules that you then put inside Voltage Modular. And my MIDI controller is basically just a module for you to purchase. So we're going to jump in at the point where you've got your Voltage Modular running on your computer. Other things that I've got going on here is I've hooked up my NymphCC to my computer via the USB cable in order to power it, but also that's my MIDI connectivity to my synth. And I've also got in front of me here a keyboard controller. It's a Nord keyboard, and that's also connected to my computer via MIDI, via USB, so that I can actually play the synth and demonstrate what I'm doing to you. So here we have Voltage Modular with an empty Eurorack case, very sad, on my screen here. There's a library button here, which opens up their online library of modules. There's an online store. This is where you would browse and find modules to buy. As you'll see there, they're very, very reasonably priced. This is where you will find my MIDI controller once it's available. As I'm recording this video, it's not there yet. I haven't released it into their online store, but it will be there very, very soon, and I'll announce that on my YouTube channel when that happens. So you'll be able to find my MIDI controller here, but for the time being, I'm going to switch to my own personal library of modules. These are modules that I've either bought or developed myself. And there is my MIDI controller. It's called NymphCC. So I'm just going to add it to my virtual rack. Let's get rid of the library, and there you'll see it. So now let's just get on and get it hooked up to my keyboard, hooked up to the synth, and then we can start playing around with it and we can hear some sounds. Now, I'm going to show a little graphic on the screen right now, how you need to connect any MIDI controller, whether it's software or hardware, in order to be able to play a synth through a keyboard as well as be able to control it through the MIDI controller. You're basically going to need to sort of daisy chain the MIDI connections. And the way that we do that with NymphCC is I simply select as its output in this little MIDI section over here, I select my NymphCC, which is there, and I'm going to select as my input my MIDI controller keyboard, which is this Nord Wave 2. Right, one thing to just cover before we start playing some sounds and mucking about with sliders, and that is presets. Now, obviously, you have presets on your NymphCC. There are some preset slots, different banks. You can save and load presets directly on the synth. And I'm sure that Dreadbox will be coming out with their own software editor very soon, where you can save and load those banks from a computer. So that'll be great when that comes out. What I've got going on with my MIDI controller is just an alternative to that. Because as I am sort of like keeping track of where all of these sliders are that you move around, I thought, well, why the hell not just be able to save those as a preset on your computer? I guess for me, the benefit of doing it on the computer here is that you can organize your presets how you like. You can give them whatever names you like. You can store them in whatever folders you like. And of course, you can share them with other people if you want to. Here, this little box here at the top here is called preset. We can initialize a preset, load one, and save one. So let's just do initialize. There we are. We have a classic sawtooth initialized patch going on, and we can start to move these sliders around. So presets, we've got initialize, we can load and save. So let's go and load one. So I've got a little folder system going on here. You'll see that I've named the folders, sort of kind of makes sense to me at least. We'll load one here. You see all the sliders move to those positions. Let's load another one. Now, as soon as we start to move a slider, we'll see that there are little digital displays here, previous and current, and they will show what the last saved value of that parameter was and what you've currently set it to. So if I move, say, the decay, so the saved value is 72, and I'm now changing it. Now, we're generating here MIDI messages and sending them to the NymphCC, and MIDI messages, or the standard MIDI messages that are being used here, have a maximum of 128 values, going from 0 to 127. So you'll see here, as I move the slider to the very top, the maximum value there is 127, and at the bottom it's 0. So that's the range that we've got here, basically for all of these parameters. So one thing I just want to mention, just a little feature here, it's called linear logarithmic. It's a little switch that I've implemented here over on the right hand side. It's basically changing the way that these sliders respond and the values that they will then create, that then get sent as MIDI messages to the NymphCC and get saved as a patch. Now by default we have linear mode. Now what linear mode is well, you'll see here with the sliders, as I move any slider or any control inside Voltage Modular around, you'll see there as a little sort of like pop-up. Just, it disappears as soon as I stop. But you'll see there's a little tooltip, I think it's called. You'll see what that control is set to in terms of its value. So if I put it to, say, 64, you'll see there that the current value that I would save with that patch and I will send to the synth is 64. And that's what linear is. Whatever value you see here, I'm going to be using that exact same value. But if we switch to logarithmic, now the response of the controls is curved. And that means you've got an awful lot more control down below for lower values, which can be very useful if you're applying modulation effects, for example. So as you can see here, the slider is at around 27, but the actual value I'm going to use and save is just 5. Obviously it catches up with itself eventually, so as I move towards the top, you'll see now I've got 104 and the value I will use is 85, and by the time I get to the very top, 127, 127. It's a curved response. It can be useful for, as I say, it's little small fine values that you want to set. One thing I will mention though is that, as you can see, as you switch between these settings, you will see sliders moving up and down. You won't see them moving up and down if they're right at 0 or at 127, because those values still are correct. But I'm moving those sliders around so that their positions are going to match what the patch is that you've created at any point in time, so that as you switch between these two modes, there is no sudden immediate change in the sound of your patch. Right, so let's now turn our attention to global modulations, because the way that they are implemented in the NymphCC is absolutely fantastic, and I've got a very specific way that I've implemented them inside my MIDI controller. Now the way I've implemented these modulations here is, well, the best thing for me to do is actually to load a patch as an example. So I'll load a very, very simple little patch, and you'll see here with this little encoder here that there is some modulation going on. And if we look over on the right hand side at the mod source selector, you'll see that it's pointing at LFO number 2. So basically what I've got here with these little potentiometers is they're not one knob per function. What you see here as a value is dependent on the mod source that you've chosen here on the right hand side. So if I move to, say, mod wheel, you'll see that the high pass filter is not being modulated at all by the mod wheel. But then if I go back to LFO number 2, you'll see that it is. Okay, let's talk about a little bit more of an in-depth topic now. Let's talk about MIDI connectivity, because we kind of glossed over it before. All we did was just set the input to be our keyboard, the output to be our synth, and we just played it that way. And that works, 99% of the time, no problem whatsoever. There are complications when you want to run Voltage Modular, basically the MIDI controller, as a plugin in your DAW, which I'll talk about later on. But there are other things that you might want to do in terms of MIDI connectivity with the MIDI controller, which we'll talk about now. So let's just look at some of the other things that are going on in this little white box here, which is labeled MIDI. So as well as these two connections here, which I would call direct connections. They are direct connections to the MIDI devices on your computer. When you click on the button, this list is taken from your computer. These are all the MIDI devices that are available on my computer right now, including USB devices that might be connected to it. Whereas this one here, this is a different type of connection. It's still a MIDI connection. It's a little sort of like DIN socket graphic to it, but this is a voltage modular connection. And you use this to connect to other modules within Voltage Modular that support MIDI, as well as the Voltage Modular environment itself. So for me to explain that, I need to basically scroll up to the top of this virtual Eurorack case. Let's move my module up there so everything's close together. You'll see here this control panel that exists at the top of your Eurorack case here. Now, there's a lot going on here. There's lots of things you can do. I'm not going to talk about it because it is a voltage modular set of functions. It's very well documented in their documentation. So take a look at that if you're interested. But here is what I want to show you. It's a MIDI socket and it's labeled from host. Now, this is going to supply MIDI into our virtual environment here. And I could take a connection and I could plug it into my module and use MIDI coming from it. Now what's coming from it is determined when you're running Voltage Modular as a standalone app like we're doing right now. What's coming into it is determined by a setup page here. There's an audio/MIDI tab, and there again is a list of the devices on my PC, the MIDI devices, and I could choose one here. Now this is something I just want to point out. I can't choose Nord Wave 2 MIDI device right now, and the reason for that is because I've already chosen it here in my MIDI controller. Some MIDI devices allow multiple connections to them and others don't. The Nord USB driver doesn't allow multiple connections, only one at a time. So I'm actually going to have to turn it off here, so I'm not connected anymore. Now I can go in and I should be able to select it like that. So now it is Voltage Modular itself, which is connecting to that particular MIDI device, and I've got that data flowing here into my MIDI controller exactly the same as if I'd selected it here, and we should be able to play the synthesizer exactly the same as before. So that's an alternative way of having MIDI input into the MIDI controller. What that does is it frees up this MIDI input. And now I want to talk about why you might want to have use of this MIDI input. So in terms of the NymphCC itself, it's an analog synth, and these sliders are analog controls. They are infinitely variable, completely and utterly beautiful, smooth. You can do wonderful filter sweeps, resonance sweeps, whatever you want to do with the synth itself. When it comes to a MIDI controller, whether it's this one, software or hardware, at the end of the day, what these things are doing is generating MIDI messages and sending them to the NymphCC to do that filter sweep for you. And as I might have mentioned before, there's a certain resolution to those messages in terms of the number of possible values that they can send. A standard MIDI message, which is what is being implemented here in the NymphCC, you've only got 128 different values that can be sent to it. And what that means is that you could, if you were trying to do a filter sweep using a MIDI controller, you might hear some stepping as you move from one of those values to the next. It all depends on the patch, on the music you're playing, but you might hear some stepping. So if you want really, really smooth filter sweeps, then there's nothing better than to use the analog control on your analog synth. But the problem with me fiddling around with this slider here is that if I do that, then my patch and the position of my sliders in my MIDI controller is no longer matching what is actually going on in terms of the sound in this synth anymore. There's a disparity between them, and if I was to save that preset, for example, I wouldn't be saving exactly what the patch is in terms of the synth. So that's when we might want to have two-way MIDI communication between the synth and the MIDI controller. And because we've freed up this slot here, it means I can now go in here, choose NymphCC, and now I've got two-way communication. I'm sending MIDI CCs to it, and I'm receiving MIDI CCs from it. And what that means is that if I was to move one of these sliders, as you'll see there, the MIDI controller is now mimicking what I'm doing in terms of hardware, and it's keeping in sync with what I'm changing directly on the synth itself, which is really, really useful to do. Right, so let me just show you very, very quickly how you run my MIDI controller inside your DAW. Actually, what you're going to be running inside your DAW is Voltage Modular, which is going to then host the MIDI controller. It's very, very simple, very, very straightforward, and very, very similar to running Voltage Modular standalone. Let's take a look. Okay, so my DAW is Cubase, but I'm sure the process is very, very similar no matter what your DAW is. The way that we run Voltage Modular inside it as a plugin is to choose a new instrument track, which is what we're going to do there. And then we choose Voltage Modular as the instrument. Let's add the track. And we get up a window that looks very similar to standalone Voltage Modular. It's a Eurorack case with nothing in it at the moment. And we can go to the library. And we can go and pick from our library NymphCC. We can add it in, close the library down because we don't need it anymore. And there we go. We've got our first sort of row in our virtual rack here. And there it is. Now, the difference between running it standalone and running it like this is to do with MIDI connections. And I did mention this when we were talking about MIDI before. But this connection here, this from host connection, is very important because what's going to come through to this is the MIDI data that we end up recording inside our DAW. So what we need to do is take a connection from there, a cable from there, plug it into NymphCC, and now we are hooked up to the DAW and to our whatever keyboard we want to use inside our DAW to play the synth with. The only connection that we need to make after that is actually connecting up the MIDI controller itself to the NymphCC synth. So I'm going to do that here. I'll choose that first one. And I'm just going to initialize a patch just to make sure that it is initialized. And just to prove to you that it's working. There we go. Now, everything that you do inside Voltage Modular here, when you're running it as a plugin, other modules that you add in there, any connections you make with cables, in fact, all the control settings, all of that stuff gets saved as part of my Cubase project when I save the project. And I'm sure that that will be the same with other DAWs. But the one thing that won't get saved is this direct MIDI connection. You'll have to make it each time because Voltage Modular doesn't really know about this connection. But everything else will be saved as part of the project that we've got going on here. So it's really very, very convenient. It's very, very simple and straightforward. And it's just like using it standalone apart from that MIDI connection. That's it. Okay, let's talk about something I'm really quite excited about, and that is polychaining. Now, polychaining is a way of using multiple synthesizers together to increase the amount of polyphony that's available to you. Generally speaking, polychaining is implemented inside the synthesizer itself, and you daisy chain using MIDI. You daisy chain your synths together. The first synth in the chain will react to some of the notes that it receives over MIDI, and then it'll hand the rest to the next one in the chain, which will then react to some of those notes and hand the rest to the next one in the chain, etc., etc., etc. So it's normally a capability that's built into the synthesizers. It's not built into the NymphCC itself. It could be added in firmware. I'm not sure whether Dreadbox will be able to do that, because you need to be able to daisy chain your synths together. There's no physical MIDI out or through on the back of a NymphCC. The only way to get MIDI out is over USB, so it would be challenging to daisy chain these together. What I've decided to do was see if I could control two NymphCCs at the same time, because let's face it, I am passing on any note data to the NymphCCs, I'm passing on MIDI CC data as well, so why not try and see if I could control two at the same time. So that's what I've implemented. I only developed it a couple of days ago. I'm testing it at the moment. It seems to work quite well, so I'm okay with demoing it to you. So basically, what I haven't mentioned here in terms of MIDI is that there's a little number 1 that you can see there against this output. That's because there are actually two MIDI outs that you can have connected to the controller at the same time. I decided to implement it this way because I didn't want to make the whole module any bigger. I think it's already too big as it is. So I've tried to keep the space down. Basically, you switch between the outputs that you want to connect to with this little switch here. So as I press the switch, click the switch, you'll see it says number 2 and back to number 1. So if I take number 1 and I connect number 1 to one of my NymphCCs, you'll see there's one there and there's another one down there. I've got both of them connected here to my computer. I'll choose the first one in the list. And then if I go to number 2, you'll see it's not connected. So let's go and connect the second one. So now I've got two NymphCCs connected. It's unfortunate that the USB driver doesn't show up as NymphCC 1, NymphCC 2, whatever. But you'll have to just look at, see where they are in that list to know which one you're connecting to. So I'm connecting to both of them now. Let's connect my MIDI keyboard, my Nord. I'm going to put my headphones on so I can hear. And let's see what that sounds like. I'm just going to initialize the patch. Just send them both MIDI CCs to initialize the patch. Now I've got here, in this section here, I've got a set of 3 different algorithms for allocating notes to the two synths. We've got ping pong, random, and unison. So I'm just going to play one note at a time. Now what I've done is I have these are mono outputs from these synths. I've panned them not 100% but slightly left and right so you can hear the difference between the two synths as I play. So I'm just going to play one note and repeat it. This is ping pong mode. Straight allocation, hand a note to that one, now hand it to that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one. It sounds really great with arpeggios and sequences and that kind of thing. Then we've got random, which is literally exactly what it says. It's like tossing a coin and saying which one should get this note. If you're unlucky, the same synth will get the same note about 20 times. But generally speaking, it's a nice sort of spread. It sounds like this. I thought for a while it was just it was preferring one of the synths over the other, but it is completely random, and random tends to work really nicely when you're playing chords rather than sequences and stuff. Oh, it can sound nice with sequences as well. The third option I've got here is called unison. That is not the same as the play mode unison. This is unison as in I am sending whatever notes I receive here to both synths at the same time. So you get some really big fat sounds with unison. That's the same note to both synths. And you can hear that there's a slight tuning variation between them because these are 100% analog. Sounds very nice. So that's the unison mode. This is random. And this is ping pong. Now this is completely separate to the play modes. We are playing both the synths in poly mode. That means that in unison here, we've still got 6 voice polyphony, but we've just got double the sound. But when we go to random or ping pong, we've basically got 12 voices of polyphony available to us. If I was to hold down 12 notes here with my 12 fingers, we would have 6 playing on one synth and 6 playing on the other. But using this polychaining can sound really cool with these other modes as well. You know, you can use the try mode to have 3 note polyphony per synth. So because I'm using polychaining, I've still got 6 notes of polyphony, but I'm using 2 oscillators per voice to create some much bigger, fatter sounds. And it even sounds great with mono. I mean, it sounds great with any of these modes, to be honest with you. But okay, I'll do 6 voice unison, and I will do unison. So when I hold down a key, you're hearing 12 voices. So I think it sounds really great, and we're just listening to an initialized patch. That's all we're listening to. We haven't actually done anything with the sound at all, just to prove that these sliders work in polychain mode. Let's go to play some chords. Everything else works exactly as it should, except we're dealing with 2 synths instead of just the one. That is basically NymphCC. That's pretty much all you need to know about it to be able to use it. There is something else that I need to cover next, which is NymphCV, which is the CV expansion capability for this MIDI controller. That will be in a follow-up video. So until then, as always, thank you very much for watching.